The mailbox stood empty again today, just as it had for the past 43 years. I pulled my hand back from the rusted metal door and felt that familiar hollow ache settle in my chest, the same one that started in a foxhole outside San in 1968, when I realized that love letters sent into silence might as well be prayers whispered to an empty sky. My name is Thomas Michael Garrett, though most folks around here just call me Tom. I'm 76 now, which means I was 19 when I shipped out to Vietnam with the 3rd Battalion 26th Marines. 19 and stupid, in love with a girl named Catherine Rose McKenna who had hair like spun copper and eyes the color of October leaves. We'd gotten engaged 3 weeks before I left, promising each other forever with the desperate certainty that only comes when you're young and the world is trying to tear you apart. I wrote her 134 letters during my 13 months in country. Not postcards or quick notes, but real letters, pages and pages filled with everything I couldn't say out loud. I wrote about the monsoon rains that turned our base into a sea of red mud, about the way the jungle smelled like death and growing things all at once. I wrote about the other Marines in my unit, good men with names like Rodriguez and O'Brien and Washington, men who became brothers in the way that only happens when you're sharing the same small space between life and death every single day. But mostly I wrote about coming home to her. I never got a single letter back. The silence stretched on for months, an absence that grew heavier than my pack, heavier than my rifle, heavier than the grief I carried for the friends who didn't make it out of those green hills. In my more optimistic moments, I told myself the mail system was just slow, that her letters were sitting in some mailroom in Saigon waiting to catch up with me. In my darker hours, and there were plenty of those, I wondered if she'd simply stopped loving me, if the distance and time had worn away whatever we'd had until it was thin as rice paper. The worst part wasn't the not knowing. The worst part was that I kept writing anyway. Letter 47 was written during the siege at San, huddled in a bunker while North Vietnamese artillery shells fell like deadly rain around our perimeter. The ground shook so hard my handwriting looked like a seismograph, but I kept going, telling Catherine about the way the sunrise looked through the smoke, how even in hell you could still find something beautiful if you looked hard enough. Letter 82 was composed in a field hospital after I took shrapnel in my left leg. The morphine made everything soft around the edges, and I wrote about wanting to dance with her at our wedding, hoping the limp wouldn't be permanent. It wasn't mostly, though I still feel it when the weather changes. Letter 134 was written on the transport plane home somewhere over the Pacific. I was different by then. We all were. The boy who'd left San Diego 13 months earlier had stayed behind in those jungle trails and firebase perimeters. The man coming home carried his ghosts in a duffel bag along with his dress blues and his Bronze Star and his collection of unsent love letters. I'd kept copies of them all. I'm not sure why exactly. Maybe I thought she'd want to see them someday to understand what those months had been like. Maybe I just needed proof that I'd tried to keep her close even when half a world stood between us. When I got back to San Diego in March of '69, I went straight to her apartment on Laurel Street. I'd memorized that address, had written it on envelope after envelope until the words looked like a prayer. But when I climbed those familiar stairs and knocked on the door, a stranger answered, a middle-aged woman with gray hair and suspicious eyes. "Catherine McKenna," she said, squinting at me like I was speaking a foreign language. "Haven't heard that name in months. She moved out last summer, said she was getting married to some boy from back east." The words hit me like incoming fire. I must have stood there for a full minute just staring at this woman who was holding the ruins of my future in her casual dismissal. When I finally found my voice, I asked if she had a forwarding address. "Nope," she said, already starting to close the door. "Just packed up one day and left. Seemed to be in a hurry about it." I walked back to my truck on unsteady legs, feeling like I'd been gut-shot. The letters in my duffel bag suddenly felt like evidence of my own stupidity. 134 pages of one-sided conversation with a woman who'd moved on with her life while I was writing love letters in foxholes. But I couldn't quite bring myself to throw them away. Instead, I did what any sensible person would do. I got drunk for 3 days straight, then sobered up and got on with the business of building a life without her. I used my GI benefits to get a degree in mechanical engineering, found a job at the shipyard, bought a small house in Hillcrest with a view of the bay. I dated other women, good women who deserved better than someone who was still carrying a torch for a ghost. I even came close to marrying one of them, Linda Patterson, a nurse who was patient with my nightmares and never asked too many questions about why I kept a shoebox of old letters in the back of my closet. But it didn't work out. None of them did, really. How do you explain to someone that you're still in love with a memory? How do you tell them that you measure every laugh, every kiss, every quiet moment against something that happened when you were 19 and stupid and full of hope? The years passed. The Vietnam War became history, something they talked about in documentaries and textbooks. My hair turned gray, then white. My friends from the war scattered to the four winds, some thriving, some struggling, too many taking the early exit that comes at the end of a bottle or a needle or a rope. I went to their funerals when I could, stood at attention while they played taps, and wondered why I'd been the one to make it through relatively intact. I never stopped thinking about Catherine, but the sharp edge of that loss eventually wore smooth, became just another part of who I was. Like the scar on my leg or the way I still woke up sometimes reaching for a rifle that wasn't there, it was something I'd learned to live with. Then, 23 years after I came home from Vietnam, I saw her again. It was a Saturday morning in October, and I was at the farmer's market in Hillcrest, buying tomatoes and trying to decide between two types of apples. I turned toward the flower stand and there she was, maybe 30 feet away, holding the hand of a boy who looked to be about 10 years old. She was still beautiful, though her copper hair had faded to auburn and there were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there when we were young. She was wearing a blue dress that made her look like the woman I'd fallen in love with at 19, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. The boy was saying something to her, tugging on her hand with the impatience of children everywhere, and she laughed, that same laugh I'd carried in my memory through 13 months of war and 23 years of wondering. The sound of it hit me like a physical blow, and I had to steady myself against the apple vendor's table. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, just watching her move through the market with her son, memorizing the way she touched his shoulder when she leaned down to listen to him, the way she smiled at the vendors, the way she still tucked her hair behind her left ear when she was thinking. Part of me wanted to walk over, to tap her on the shoulder and say hello, to finally close the circle that had been open for so long. But I didn't. Instead, I followed them at a distance, keeping far enough back that she wouldn't notice me, close enough that I could pretend for a few more minutes that I was part of their life. They walked to a blue Honda Accord parked on Fifth Avenue, and I watched her buckle the boy into the passenger seat with the careful attention of a mother who'd learned not to take anything for granted. As she walked around to the driver's side, she glanced back toward the market, and for just a moment our eyes met across the distance. I saw recognition flicker across her face, saw her mouth form my name, but before she could say anything, I turned and walked away. I spent the rest of that day driving aimlessly through the city, trying to process what I'd seen. She had a son, which meant she'd built a life, a family, all the things we'd once talked about building together. The rational part of my brain was happy for her, she deserved all the joy the world could offer. But the 19-year-old Marine who still lived somewhere in my chest felt like he'd been shot all over again. That night, I pulled out the shoebox of letters I'd kept all these years. I'd read them occasionally over the years, usually when I'd had too much to drink and was feeling sorry for myself. But this time was different. This time I read them like I was trying to solve a mystery, looking for clues to a puzzle I'd never understood. It was in letter 73 that I found it, a throwaway line about how I hoped her mother was feeling better after her surgery. I'd completely forgotten about Mrs. McKenna's illness, but as I read those words again, something clicked into place. Catherine's mother had been sick that summer before I left, and Catherine had been talking about moving back home to help take care of her. What if that's what had happened? What if she'd left San Diego not because she'd stopped loving me, but because her family needed her? What if my letters had been going to an empty apartment all along? The possibility hit me like a revelation. For 23 years I'd carried the weight of thinking she'd simply forgotten about me, that whatever we'd had hadn't been strong enough to survive my absence. But what if the truth was simpler and more heartbreaking than that? What if she'd never gotten my letters at all? I spent the next 2 weeks tracking her down, using skills I'd learned in the military and connections I'd made over the years. It wasn't hard. Catherine McKenna had become Catherine Walsh, and she lived in a modest ranch house in Claremont with her husband David and their son Michael. David Walsh was a high school English teacher, by all accounts a good man who coached Little League and volunteered at the church. They'd been married for 22 years. I sat in my truck outside their house for 3 hours one evening, watching the warm light spill from their windows, seeing the shadows of their family life play out against the curtains. At one point, Catherine came to the window and looked out into the darkness, and I wondered if some part of her could sense that I was there. That the ghost of her first love was sitting in the dark, trying to figure out what to do with 23 years of accumulated longing. In the end, I did what I should have done years earlier. I went home, gathered up all 134 letters, and put them in a manila envelope. I wrote a short note, maybe a paragraph, explaining who I was and why I was giving them to her. I told her I wasn't looking for anything from her, that I just thought she should know that someone had loved her enough to write to her from the other side of the world, even when the letters weren't getting through. I drove to her house at 2 in the morning and slipped the envelope into her mailbox. Then I drove home and tried to figure out how to let go of something I'd been holding on to for most of my adult life. I never heard from her. Not directly, anyway. But 3 months later, I got a phone call from a young man who introduced himself as Michael Walsh. He had a voice like his mother's, soft but strong, and he asked if I was the Thomas Garrett who'd served in Vietnam with the 3rd Battalion, 26th Marines. Yes, I said, though my throat had gone dry. I was wondering if we could meet, he said. I have some questions about my mother, and I think you might be the only person who can answer them. We met at a diner in Kearney Mesa on a Thursday afternoon. Michael was 12 then, all knees and elbows and serious eyes that reminded me painfully of Catherine's. He ordered a chocolate milkshake and slid a manila envelope across the table, the same envelope I'd left in their mailbox 3 months earlier. She cried when she read these, he said without preamble. She locked herself in her room for 2 days, and when she came out her eyes were all red and she kept staring at nothing. Dad didn't know what to do. I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup to keep them steady. I'm sorry if I upset her. That wasn't my intention. She told me about you, Michael continued. About how you were engaged before you went to war, about how she thought you were dead because the letters stopped coming. She said she waited for 2 years before she gave up hope. The words hit me like a physical blow. 2 years. She'd waited 2 years for letters that were being delivered to an empty apartment while she was 3,000 miles away, taking care of her dying mother. She moved to Philadelphia, I said, more to myself than to him. It wasn't a question. Her mom got sicker, Michael confirmed. Catherine dropped out of college and went home to take care of her. She was there for almost 3 years. When she came back to California, she tried to find you, but you'd moved. The Marine Corps told her you'd been discharged, but they couldn't give her any more information. I closed my eyes and let the full weight of it settle on me. We'd spent 23 years living parallel lives, both of us carrying the weight of a love that had never been properly finished, both of us wondering what might have been if things had been different. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Michael was quiet for a long moment, stirring his milkshake with a red plastic spoon. When he finally looked up, his eyes were older than his 12 years. Because I read your letters, he said simply. All of them. And I needed to know who was the man who loved my mother so much that he kept writing to her even when she couldn't write back. We sat in silence for a while, this boy and I, connected by a woman we both loved, and a story that had taken more than 2 decades to find its ending. Finally, Michael reached into his backpack and pulled out a letter, not one of mine but something written in careful cursive on cream-colored stationery. She wanted me to give you this, he said, but she also wanted me to tell you that she's happy, that she loves Dad and she loves me, and she wouldn't change her life even if she could. She said you'd understand. I took the letter but didn't open it right away. I could feel its weight in my hands, the final piece of a puzzle that had been missing for most of my adult life. She also said to tell you that she kept one thing," Michael added. "A picture of you in your dress blues that you sent with letter number 16. She said she couldn't bring herself to throw it away even after she got married. It's in her jewelry box underneath the tray where she keeps her wedding ring when she does dishes." I had to look away then because the boy was 12 years old and didn't need to see a grown man cry in a diner booth over a chocolate milkshake and a love story that had ended before he was born. When I got home that evening, I finally opened Catherine's letter. It was only one page, written in the same careful handwriting I remembered from the notes she used to leave in my textbooks when we were in college together. "Dear Tom, I don't know how to begin this letter because I don't know how to apologize for 23 years of silence. I got your letters, all 134 of them, and I've read each one at least a dozen times. They're beautiful and heartbreaking, and they've shown me a version of myself that I'd almost forgotten existed, the girl who was brave enough to love a soldier, who was foolish enough to believe that love could survive anything. I want you to know that I never stopped loving you, not really. But I also want you to know that I love David and I love the life we've built together. I know that might sound impossible, like I'm trying to hold two contradictory truths at the same time, but I think maybe that's what love is sometimes, learning to carry more than one story in your heart." Michael asked me why I never tried harder to find you when I came back from Philadelphia. The truth is, I was afraid. I was afraid that too much time had passed, that we'd both changed too much to bridge the gap. I was afraid that the boy I'd fallen in love with had been changed by the war in ways I couldn't understand. Mostly, I was afraid that if I found you, I'd have to choose between the life I'd built and the life I'd dreamed of, and I wasn't sure I was strong enough to make that choice. I was wrong to be afraid, and I'm sorry. You deserved better than silence. You deserved to know why the letters stopped coming. Deserved to know that someone was waiting for you even when it seemed like the whole world had forgotten you existed. I hope you found happiness, Tom. I hope you found someone who loves you the way you deserve to be loved. If you haven't, I hope you know that it's not because you're not worthy of it. Some love stories don't get happy endings, but that doesn't make them less true. Thank you for writing to me, even when I couldn't write back. Thank you for loving me across time and distance and silence. Thank you for giving me something beautiful to carry with me, even when carrying it hurt. With all my love, Catherine." I read that letter probably 50 times over the next few weeks, and each time I found something new in it, some small grace note that helped me understand not just what had happened between us, but what it meant that it had happened at all. She was right about love stories not always getting happy endings, but she was also right about that not making them less true. The strange thing was, reading her letter didn't make me sadder. If anything, it felt like a weight lifting off my chest, like I could finally breathe all the way in for the first time in 23 years. I understood now that our story wasn't a tragedy, it was just life, messy and complicated, and full of missed connections and bad timing, and the kind of love that's too big to fit neatly into the space the world gives you for it. I started writing again, not letters to Catherine, but stories about the war, about the men I'd served with, about what it meant to come home to a world that had moved on without you. I'd never thought of myself as a writer, but something about finally finishing that long conversation with Catherine had freed up space in my head for other words, other stories that needed telling. Michael and I kept in touch over the years. He'd call every few months just to check in, and we'd talk about school or sports or whatever 12-year-old boys were interested in. As he got older, our conversations deepened. He asked me about the war, about what it was like to be a soldier, about how you learn to live with the weight of things you can't change. When he turned 18, he asked if I'd write him a letter of recommendation for college. He was applying to study journalism, he said, because he wanted to tell stories that mattered, stories about people who'd been forgotten or overlooked. I wrote him the best recommendation letter I could, and when he got accepted to UC Berkeley, I felt a pride that was almost paternal. Catherine and I never met again, never spoke directly, but through Michael I got glimpses of her life, her promotion to head librarian at the local elementary school, her volunteer work with literacy programs, the way she still tucked her hair behind her left ear when she was thinking. It was enough, more than enough, really. 5 years ago, Michael called to tell me that Catherine had been diagnosed with breast cancer. The treatment was going well, he said, but she was scared, and she'd asked him to call me because she wanted me to know. I sent flowers, white roses, her favorite, with a card that said simply, "Thinking of you, T." 3 years ago, he called to tell me she was in remission. 2 years ago, he graduated from Berkeley with honors and got a job at a newspaper in Portland. Last year, he called to tell me he was engaged to a teacher named Sarah, who reminded him of his mother in all the best ways. And yesterday he called to tell me that Catherine had passed away peacefully in her sleep. The cancer had come back, he said, and this time there hadn't been anything the doctors could do. She died at home, surrounded by family, holding David's hand. "She asked me to give you something," Michael said through tears that I could hear in his voice. "It's a letter. She wrote it a few months ago, when she knew she didn't have much time left. I told him I'd drive up to Portland for the funeral, but he said no, that it was family only, but that his mother had specifically said she wanted me to know how much our correspondence had meant to her, how it had helped her understand that some kinds of love transcend time and circumstance, and even death." The letter arrived today, along with something else, a small package wrapped in tissue paper. Inside was a photograph, me in my dress blues, 20 years old and full of hope, the same picture she'd kept in her jewelry box for more than 40 years. The letter was shorter than the first one she'd written me, but it was also somehow fuller, like she'd learned to say more with fewer words. "Dear Tom, if you're reading this, then Michael has kept his promise to deliver it after I'm gone. I hope that doesn't sound morbid. I've found that facing death has a way of clarifying what matters, and what matters is making sure the people you love know they're loved. I'm giving you back your photograph, not because I don't want it anymore, but because I think you should have it. Look at that young man in his dress blues. Look at how brave he was, how full of love and hope and determination. That's who you were when you wrote me 134 letters from the other side of the world. That's who you still are. I want you to know that you've been with me all these years, not as a ghost or a regret, but as a reminder of what it means to love someone completely. Every time David made me laugh, every time I watched Michael take his first steps, or hit his first home run, or graduate from high school, part of me was grateful that I'd learned from you how to recognize love when I saw it. You taught me that love isn't always about getting what you want. Sometimes it's about wanting what's best for someone else, even when that something doesn't include you. You did that when you left my letters in the mailbox, without asking for anything in return. You did it every time you talked to Michael, without trying to use him to get back to me. You did it by letting me live my life, without guilt or pressure or demands. That's the rarest kind of love, Tom. And I want you to know that I saw it, I recognized it, and I was grateful for it every single day. I hope you'll find someone to love now, someone who can love you back the way you deserve to be loved. You're 76, not 96, and you have so much love left to give. Don't waste it on a ghost, even if that ghost is grateful for the attention. Thank you for the letters. Thank you for the love. Thank you for showing me what it means to be loved so completely, that it changes who you are, even when the person doing the loving is half a world away. All my love, always. Catherine. I'm sitting in my kitchen now. The letter spread out on the table next to the photograph of my younger self. Outside, the sun is setting over San Diego Bay, painting the water gold and orange and red. In a few minutes I'll walk down to the mailbox, not to check for letters that will never come, but just to watch the light change and think about love and loss, and the strange ways our stories intersect and separate, and sometimes, if we're very lucky, find their way back to each other. I sent 134 letters, and never got a reply, but I got something better in the end. I got to understand that love isn't always about possession or fulfillment, or getting the ending you thought you wanted. Sometimes love is about bearing witness to someone else's life, about caring for them across time and distance and silence, about letting them be happy, even when their happiness doesn't include you. Catherine was right. I do have love left to give. Maybe it's time to stop writing letters to the past, and start writing new stories, with whatever time I have left. Maybe it's time to open my heart to the possibility that love stories can have more than one beginning, more than one ending, more than one chance to surprise you with their grace. The mailbox stands empty today, just as it has for 43 years. But for the first time in all those years, that emptiness doesn't feel like an absence. It feels like space. Space for new stories, new letters, new love. Space for whatever comes next. I pick up the photograph of my younger self and smile at that brave, hopeful boy in his dress blues. Then I fold Catherine's letter carefully and put it in the shoebox with all the others. 134 letters that finally found their way home, plus one that showed me it's never too late to start writing a new story. The sun has set now, and the bay is dark except for the lights of the ships heading out to sea. I think about all the letters that have been written throughout history, all the words of love sent across distance and time, all the hearts that have hoped and waited, and finally learned to let go. Then I walk back inside, turn on the light, and pull out a piece of paper. There's a woman at the senior center who volunteers with the literacy program, a retired teacher with kind eyes, and a laugh that reminds me, just a little, of springtime. I've been thinking about asking her to coffee. Maybe it's time to write a letter that expects an answer.